What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Friday, March 19th. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, we have a 10-game slate tonight. So let's take a look at the point guard position. I like Derek White from the San Antonio Spurs playing the Cleveland Cavaliers, who have the 12th worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing point guards. Derek White has averaged 24.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 25 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 34, 15, and 45 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 24, and 25 minutes. He's projected at 25.7 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.4 times value. He's 4,800 FanDuel salary and 700 more on DraftKings. So he scored 24, 28, 21, and 18 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Cavaliers. So I think he's a better FanDuel play. I think he can hit value no problem on FanDuel. So I like Derek White here versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. Okay, another point guard that I like is Delon Wright from the Detroit Pistons playing the Houston Rockets, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Delon Wright has averaged 28.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 43, 36, and 31 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 37, 31, and 31 minutes. He's projected at 29 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's 5,600 FanDuel salary and 400 more on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites. So I like Delon Wright here versus the Houston Rockets. Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. This is still a great FanDuel play. DraftKings has raised the price properly, but FanDuel's still a little bit low. So I like Caris LeVert from the Indiana Pacers playing the Miami Heat, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Caris LeVert has averaged 34 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 30% usage rate. He scored 35, 30, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 33, 29, and 26 minutes. He's projected at 35 fantasy points here tonight. So on FanDuel, that's 6.3 times value. He's 5,600 FanDuel salary, but he's 1,300 more on DraftKings. So I love that FanDuel price. Now, he scored 24, 20, 18, and 21 in his last 4 games versus the Heat. Not great player versus team history, but he's on a different team now, has a different role in the offense. So I think he's a great FanDuel play. So I like Caris LeVert here versus the Miami Heat. Okay, another shooting guard that I like is Andrew Wiggins from the Golden State Warriors playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Andrew Wiggins has averaged 29.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 29, 24, and 41 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 27, 27, and 37 minutes. He's projected at 28.7 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.5 times value. He's 5,200 FanDuel salary and 800 more on DraftKings. So it looks like Steph Curry and Kelly Oubre Jr. are doubtful for tonight. So with those guys out, there's going to be a lot of usage between Andrew Wiggins and Draymond Green. So I think Andrew Wiggins makes a great play here tonight. So I like Andrew Wiggins here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Oh, and he scored 22, 42, 47, 27, and 22 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Grizzlies. So with a bump in minutes and usage, I think he should do great tonight. Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won, and then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you. Okay, another shooting guard that I like is Joe Ingles from the Utah Jazz, playing the Toronto Raptors, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Joe Ingles has averaged 23.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 49, 26, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 25, and 30 minutes. He's projected at 23.9 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's 5.4 times value because he's only $4,400 FanDuel salary, but he's $1,100 more on DraftKings. So more of a FanDuel play for me, but Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, 229.5 points scored in this game. So I like Joe Ingles here versus the Toronto Raptors. Okay, another shooting guard that I like is Tyler Hero from the Miami Heat, playing the Indiana Pacers, who have the 13th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing shooting guards. Tyler Hero has averaged 28.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 21, 23, and 40 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 25, 31, and 29 minutes. He's projected at 26.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $5,200 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings. So I like Tyler Hero here versus the Indiana Pacers. Okay, now another play that just caught my eye here. I like Marcus Smart from the Boston Celtics, playing the Sacramento Kings, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Marcus Smart has averaged 28.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 19% usage rate. He scored 28, 13, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 29, 24, and 18 minutes. So Marcus Smart was kind of out of it for a little while. He was coming back from injury, but he's had a few games under his belt now, and he did score 28 fantasy points in 29 minutes last game, and this is a great matchup, so I think this is a good spot to play Marcus Smart. He's projected at 25 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's only $5,000 FanDuel salary, and he's $300 more on DraftKings. And he scored 49, 28, 19, and 32 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Kings. So that's good player versus team history. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 235 points scored in this game. So I really like this play on both sites. So I like Marcus Smart here versus the Sacramento Kings. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. I like Mikal Bridges from the Phoenix Suns, playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Mikal Bridges has averaged 27.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 40, 22, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 33, 26, and 31 minutes. He's projected at 27.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.5 times value. He's 4,900 FanDuel salary and 300 more on DraftKings. And he scored 40, 31, 38, and 19 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Timberwolves. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 231.5 points scored in this game. So he's got pretty good player versus team history. It's a good matchup. The price is right. So I like Mikal Bridges here versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, another small forward that I like is Jaylen Brown from the Boston Celtics playing the Sacramento Kings, who have the worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Jaylen Brown has averaged 39.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 30% usage rate. He scored 51, 51, and 27 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 39, 38, and 26 minutes. He's projected at 40.3 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.4 times value. He's 7,500 FanDuel salary and 500 more on DraftKings. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 234.5 points scored in this game. So a high-scoring game, fast-paced game. It's a good matchup. So I like Jaylen Brown here versus the Sacramento Kings. Okay, another small forward that I like is Harrison Barnes from the Sacramento Kings playing the Boston Celtics, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing small forwards, but Harrison Barnes has averaged 30.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He scored 38, 25, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 35, 36, and 39 minutes. He's projected at 30.9 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's 5,900 FanDuel salary and 600 more on DraftKings. He scored 41, 27, 23, 35, and 40 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Celtics. So 4 out of those 5 games, he would have got you 5 times value or more. So I like Harrison Barnes here versus the Boston Celtics. Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. I'm going to give you a value play here. I like Nicholas Claxton from the Brooklyn Nets playing the Orlando Magic, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing power forwards. Nicholas Claxton has averaged 21.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 17 minutes per game with a 19% usage rate. He scored 28, 20, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 22, 16, and 17 minutes. He's projected at 22.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.6 times value. He's only 4,000 FanDuel salary, and he's 400 less on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites, but I especially like that price on DraftKings, where sometimes it's hard to find some good value. And he scored 33 fantasy points in his last game versus the Magic. So I like Nicholas Claxton here versus the Orlando Magic. Okay, another power forward that I like is Jeremiah Grant from the Detroit Pistons playing the Houston Rockets, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Jeremiah Grant has averaged 37.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 28% usage rate. He scored 38, 22, and 29 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 26, and 35 minutes. He's projected at 35.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.1 times value. He's 7,000 FanDuel salary and 200 more on DraftKings. He scored 38, 36, and 42 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Rockets. So I like Jeremiah Grant here versus the Houston Rockets. Okay, another power forward that I like is Kristaps Porzingis from the Dallas Mavericks playing the Portland Trailblazers, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Kristaps Porzingis has averaged 37 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 27% usage rate. He scored 29, 32, and 46 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 31, and 28 minutes. He's projected at 38.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. But I think he can score 40 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. He's $7,900 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings. He scored 36, 47, 36, and 56 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Trailblazers, so I like that player versus team history. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 234 points scored in this game, so it's a high-scoring game. It's a good matchup, so I like Kristaps Porzingis here versus the Portland Trailblazers. Okay, I'm going to give you a value play here. I like Jeff Green from the Brooklyn Nets playing the Orlando Magic, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Jeff Green has averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with a 14% usage rate. He scored 29, 36, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 34, and 30 minutes. He's projected at 19.8 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score about 22 fantasy points here, get you 5 times value or more. He's $4,200 FanDuel salary and $300 more on DraftKings. Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. So this is a tournament play. Jeff Green can definitely put up a stinker and blow up your lineup, but he's been playing well the past couple of games, been getting over 30 minutes for the last 3 games. It's a good matchup here, and his salary is reasonable, so I like Jeff Green here versus the Orlando Magic. Okay, another power forward that I like is Draymond Green from the Golden State Warriors playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing power forwards, Draymond Green has averaged 30.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 13% usage rate. He scored 44, 22, and 54 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 29, and 35 minutes. He's projected at 30.8 fantasy points here tonight, but that projection is going to have to be bumped up to at least 35 fantasy points, with Stephen Curry and Kelly Oubre Jr. doubtful if they miss those games, so that will give him 5 times value or more. He's $6,600 FanDuel salary and $100 more on DraftKings. So I like Draymond Green here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Oh, and Draymond Green scored 33, 35, 42, and 31 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Grizzlies. So that puts him in a really good spot with Kelly Oubre Jr. and Stephen Curry out. Draymond Green, one of my favorite plays on the slate tonight. Okay, moving on to the center position. I like Enes Kanter from the Portland Trailblazers playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Enes Kanter has averaged 30.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He scored 38, 22, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 27, and 26 minutes. He's projected at 32 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.3 times value. He's 6,000 FanDuel salary and 900 more on DraftKings. So I like this pick because Vegas thinks there's going to be 234 points scored in this game, and I especially like that FanDuel price at only 6,000 salary. So I like Enes Kanter here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Another center I like, a stud for you, I like Nikola Vucevic from the Orlando Magic playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Nikola Vucevic has averaged 47.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 30% usage rate. He scored 47, 58, and 37 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 35, 38, and 29 minutes. He's projected at 48.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's 9,700 FanDuel salary and 200 more on DraftKings. He scored 41, 68, 27, 36, and 39 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Nets. Not as good player versus team history as I would have expected here. He's got that big 68 fantasy point game, but outside of that, he wouldn't have hit 5 times value. But he's been on a roll lately. He's been on fire. So I like Nikola Vucevic here versus the Brooklyn Nets. Okay, and another center I like is Jonas Valanciunas from the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Golden State Warriors, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Jonas Valanciunas has averaged 34.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 20, 48, and 44 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 23, 26, and 29 minutes. He's projected at 36.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.9 times value. He's 7,300 FanDuel salary and 200 more on DraftKings. So he scored 61, 28, 18, and 49 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Golden State Warriors. So 50% of the time, he absolutely smashed value. It's a fast-paced game in a good matchup versus a short-handed Warriors team. So I like Jonas Valanciunas here versus the Golden State Warriors. If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.